there's also an option to share just the window, and that should let you use PowerPoint, but
it doesn't ask me for anything.
didn't for me.
But if I move it,
yeah, that'll do. Great.
Do you have it?
Can you see that okay, Maria?
Yeah. So we can start, yes?
Yeah.
Oh.
Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry, I think I tried to do something. Give me a sec. I just can't see you, but that's fine.
Okay, sorry for inconvenience.
That's really good. That's perfect.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so hello everybody. Hello, dear colleagues. My name is Maria Rakhmaninova. I'm a professor in social and political philosophy, anarchist studies researcher, and co-founder of the journal Akrateia, which is devoted to post-Soviet studies of anarchist thought. Nikolai Gerasimov, who spoke yesterday, is my colleague from the journal. And we translate foreign texts and try to expand the Russian and Ukrainian language contemporary anarchist thought, alas unknown in the West. So perhaps someone will be interested in our project. So I'm very glad to be here with you today, and I would like to express my gratitude to the organizers of this conference and to all the panelists. The previous presentations left best impressions and gave rise to many new thoughts. So also I want to apologize once for my English. A long lack of oral practice left me just a textual register of language, but even in it, errors creep in sometimes. So I ask to excuse me. And in any way, I hope for understanding. So the topic of my presentation is called Peter Kropotkin, Between Classical and New Materialisms. The next slide, please. One of Kropotkin's main discoveries is the phenomenon of mutual aid between creatures of different species. A panoramic review of this phenomenon forms the basis of his treatise, Mutual Aid as a Factor of Evolution, revealing it in all animal species. The radicality of Kropotkin's statement appears to us in full if we consider the consensus in the scientific community against which Kropotkin writes his work. In short, it can be described as a system of postulates essentializing competition, struggle, and confrontation of all against all, which is quite typical for the picture of the world, the impulse for which was given by Thomas Hobbes. The next slide, please. Kropotkin, a follower of Darwin, interestingly complements his theory of evolution, arguing first that all living things are inherently mutualistic as they are struggling, and for the same reason, because of the need to survive. Second, Kropotkin shares and develops Darwin's concept of evolution as a single trajectory of species formation. According to this concept, at the origin of the human was a creature that was not human. In this sense, Kropotkin is unanimous with the positivists and other scientists of his time who first deny the idea of the specificity of man as a species among other species, and second insist on the perspective of essentialism, which claims that all living things, including man, have stable essences which unfold their features during life. It is for this thesis that Kropotkin is criticized by many philosophers working from an anarchist and later post-anarchism perspective, from Alexei Borovoi to, Saul Newman maybe. First, Kropotkin loses the key idea of the individual that distinguishes him from Marxism, which is rigid economic determinism that leaves no room for the individual's uniqueness. And second, because he ascribes to man a set of innate features that constitute his nature in both the physical and moral sense. Next slide, please. This criticism does indeed seem appropriate especially after Sartre, who proclaimed that man, next slide please, quote, has no nature but freedom, end quote. In this thesis, he put classical European ontology on a new track, rejecting its essentialism and opposing it with his project of existentialism. Existence precedes essence, he declared. Essence does not precede existence. This view gave impetus to a host of new intellectual trends and markedly changed the direction of philosophical anthropology. And yet it retained the framework of an earlier metaphysical picture of the world, in which things and ideas, culture and nature, subject and object, belong to different registers of being and are marked differently in terms of significance. This optics was also typical for Sartre in everyday life. We all remember well how he became angry at chestnuts, finding them frighteningly repulsive and clearly entering into an ontological antagonism with them. Quote, "The chestnut was hurting my eyes," end quote, says Sartre. Next slide, please. This was the polarized picture of the world before post-structuralism and new materialisms. And therefore, up to this point, the mentioned criticism of Kropotkin's reductionism remained valid, taking into account that in metaphysical antinomies, the components always relate to each other hierarchically. In terms of classical epistemology, for which the matter is simple and mechanistic, this meant that Kropotkin as if reduces the subject to the object level, deprives the personality of its spirituality, which raises it above the world of simpler beings and inert matter, and thereby gives it a special dignity. Next slide, please. However, the revision of the very notion of matter initiated in the project of new materialisms allows us to rethink both Kropotkin's role and the central tenets of his concept, which seems especially important today, given the crisis state of most ecosystems on the planet, climate change, and the coming of clearly disastrous consequences of the current ways of human presence in the world. Indeed, leaving the metaphysical perspective, the new epistemology breaks with the mechanistic image of matter, discovering for the first time not only its complexity, but also its agency, for example, in the framework of the actor network theory, and allows, through this discovery, to abandon the subject-object prism as such, and also from the dichotomy culture-nature. This gives rise to the so-called object-oriented ontologies, as well as to agentist, vitalist, and other materialisms, which redefine not only the entire specific methodology of science, but also the entire ontology of science. The removal of the subject-object dichotomy renders impossible both the known hierarchical relation between the parts and participants of the research process, which is in itself anarchic, and it's really anarchic, and allows us to hold in attention both the register of knowledge produced in the case of the researcher and the register of the inclusion in this process, the phenomena, things, and beings of the world, as well as their influence on the course and results of the research. From this point of view, objects do not stand idle as if frozen under the subject's gaze, but interact with him, setting his conditions, revealing to him those or other of their features, and prompting him new strategies of development. This new perspective allows us to discern with amazement the paradoxical anticipation of a new materialism in Kropotkin's thesis about complexly organized networks of mutual assistance, a theme that has already been consistently developed in modernity by representatives of new materialism. In fact, he becomes the pioneer of this view. His contemporary materialists, as noted above, did not reflect on mutual aid and did not think in the anarchist categories of confederations of entities, like, for example, Jane Bennett does, one of the contemporary materialists. One of the most striking figures in this line of modern materialists is Anna Zinn. Next slide, please. A researcher of mutual aid networks between plants and mushrooms, quote, "From the point of view of mushroom researchers, the most curious example of interspecific partnership is the symbiosis of mushrooms and plant roots. Mycorrhiza is a phenomenon in which filamentous formation in mushrooms braid the roots of plants and penetrate them. Many plants without chlorophyll are completely dependent on the nutrients they receive from mushrooms that penetrate their roots. Many species of orchids are not even able to produce spruce without the help of mushrooms. In these examples, plants depend on mushrooms for their sustenance, but it is not uncommon for mushrooms to survive on plants as well." End quote. Anna Zinn speaks of our insensitivity to the most important factor in nature, species interdependence. We are so blinded by human exceptionalism that we divide the world into white and black, human and non-human, lumping together all the complex diversity that lies behind the non-human. To this short-sighted image of the world, Zinn and other materialists counter the notion that, quote, "throughout history, human nature has changed with various entanglements of interspecies dependence, and it itself represents part of interspecies relations," end quote. In Kropotkin's time, neither technology nor the general state of knowledge, scientific knowledge, yet made it possible to discover these subtle entanglements of things and beings of the world, all the more so in the aspect of such a complex manifestation as mutual aid. Today, however, the research base and technical means allow us to conclude Kropotkin's conjectures about intraspecific mutual aid firstly were correct, although in this very aspect he coincided at least with his contemporaries, and secondly turned out to be just the tip of the iceberg. Indeed, today there is a reason to talk about a previously uncovered side of Kropotkin's teaching that is unexpectedly modern and relevant, consonant with the new materialism that clearly inherits the anarchist philosophical tradition and the Akratic approach in general. I think the best example here is Ursula Le Guin. This reinterpretation also allows us to leave behind the grounds for a fair critique by anarchist individualist anthropology. And here we turn to the most important thesis of my paper. Next slide, please. In this new optic, it's not the complexity of man that is relegated to the simplicity of inert matter, but inert matter that is elevated to the complexity previously attributed to man alone, commodifying him and gaining access to the political, including him and his social and political practices as equals in their complex entanglements and rhythms. This new level of cooperation is a worthy and legitimate development of Kropotkin's ideas revealed through the angles of a new materialism, which in turn draws its origins from the philosophy of anarchism. Thus, Kropotkin's concept takes a turn of a century before our eyes and returns to itself more clarified and even more profound and meaningful. Outdated as a positivist in the 20th century, as an anarchist, he anticipates the ontology of a new materialisms, discovering what knowledge needed a century to go through. This long journey of the conception and such a successful outcome seems to be a vivid evidence of its validity. And that is its boldness and radicality for its time was not in vain, but more than insightful, almost visionary. And to summarize, I would like to quote another bright representative of the new materialisms. Next slide, please. Manuel de Landa says that even inorganic matter is capable of self-organization. Quote, "The inorganic energy of matter has a wider range of possibilities for structure formation than just phase transitions. In other words, even the poorest forms of matter and energy, not only those relatively simple types of matter that are involved in crystal formation, are capable of self-organization. There are, for example, such coherent waves, solitons, which form in various types of materials, from ocean waters, where they are called tsunamis, to lasers. There are also stable states, or attractors, that can sustain coherent cyclic activity. Finally, unlike previous examples of nonlinear self-organization, where true novelty cannot rise, there are various combinations into which entities formed during previous processes, crystals, coherent vibrations, cyclic patterns, can enter. To summarize, these forms of spontaneous structural generation tell us that inorganic matter is far more diverse and creative than we could ever imagine. And this intuition about the inherent creative power of matter must be fully incorporated into our new materialist philosophies." End quote. I would like to conclude with a joke that is begging to be made here. So even inorganic matter has already figured out what to do. And what about us? So thank you for attention. Okay.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Maria. Yeah, really fascinating again. And thanks as well, Ad, for doing the slides for us. Excellent. Okay, so are you all ready for your presentation, Ole?
No, the screen sharing option is not showing up for some reason. I'm clicking the button.
As in the one at the bottom of the page?
Yes, I'm clicking it, but nothing is happening.
Okay.
Damn.
Let me see if we have
Yeah.
slides of yours.
No.
Yeah, okay. It seems like Ole's just gone to leave and return. Here he is. So hopefully it works this time.
Let's try again. Now it's working. Okay.
Okay, excellent.
And just choosing entire screen like that. Okay.
Yeah, you can see that.
Great.
Lovely. Whenever you're ready.
And here. Okay. So, yeah, you've already done the presentation of the title, so I'll skip onwards to just saying that this whole presentation is based on a chapter I wrote for a book that's coming out towards the end of this year, called Unchaining Solidarity on Mutual Aid and Anarchism with Catherine Malabou. I think it's scheduled for November. And I'm about myself. I am a teacher of ethics of nature at the philosophy at the University of Iceland, and I'm also currently working on a research project at the Icelandic Museum of Natural History on the views of nature and biodiversity, in which I'm also using Kropotkin. Let's start. I'm going to start with the contemporary. Richard Dawkins' basic thesis is that nature is bad as he says in his famous book, The Selfish Genes, we cannot find anything moral, any traces of social behavior in nature. We're born selfish. Evolution produces selfish individuals. The Selfish Gene is a profoundly moral book, much more than it's about biology. It's about ethics. Richard Dawkins describes nature as a fundamentally amoral thing that can only produce amoral beings. And this, he thinks, is bad. And he says, as humans, we are unique. We can break with our nature. We have the ability to be moral, but this ability does not come from our nature. It's not an instinct in our bodies. It's something we can go against. It's something we can do by going against our nature and by deliberately suppressing our instincts. I'm going to argue that this view of human nature and of nature in general is really old. It goes back all the way to the first debates in evolutionary theory, and it was not Darwin's view. Darwin's view was one of evolution as gradual changes, and where humans are, of course, part of this gradual chain of chain of gradual changes. They were not separate from nature as they are in Richard Dawkins' view. Dawkins' theory of evolution is not based in Darwin, it's based in Thomas Henry Huxley, who despite being the most ardent supporter of Darwin in public, in private he argued that he disagreed with Darwin's view of gradual changes. He thought nature could indeed take leaps, which is something Darwin said it cannot do, and that humans must be such a leap that has broken out of whatever they came from before. Humans were exceptional to Thomas Henry Huxley, as they are to Dawkins. We could also go even further and say Dawkins's view is to see the body and nature as sinful, or wicked or evil, as something we have to suppress in order to be good, and for goodness to come from some other immaterial world and unnatural world is perfectly in line with early Christian thought, which is ironic given Dawkins's status as like the most ardent public atheist. Forgot to set my timer. Here's Thomas Henry Huxley's metaphysical dualism. As Lee Kropotkin said yesterday, Thomas Henry Huxley had the same view of nature as Darwin, as Dawkins, as one of ruthless competition, fighting and destruction. It's a Hobbesian war of all against all, and the early humans must have found themselves in a similar situation. So nothing good can come from this natural process. Huxley calls this the cosmic process. This is the struggle for survival of the fittest, the ruthless competition, and it's also human nature because it's nature itself. Huxley says that there is, just like Dawkins, he says we have the ability to do something different. He calls that the ethical process. Humans are unique in that they have the capability of doing moral things, having moral considerations, and we can create laws and ethical systems, and he calls that the ethical process. And the question is, where does that process come from? He says it's fundamentally opposed to the natural process. And unlike Dawkins, Huxley agrees that yes, this is a contradiction and he cannot explain it. Unlike Dawkins, because Dawkins just brushes it away. Kropotkin's critique of Huxley applies just as well to Richard Dawkins. Kropotkin is deeply unsatisfied with this dualism. If we have the cultural capacity to go against nature and evolution, where does this capacity come from? If we believe in evolution, as Huxley did, then it must come from nature itself. Human culture and capacity for morality must be the product of evolution, not something separate from it that goes against it. If nature gives us no basis for human morality and culture, then where can it come from? How do we explain it in naturalistic terms? If it does not come from nature, then it must come from a place outside of nature. And to claim that an ethical process exists, but that it cannot be explained by anything natural, is to abandon science and naturalism. The problem is, according to Kropotkin, in the dogmatic one-sided view of nature as only something that contains only evil and amoral things. If you have that view, then of course you cannot explain behaviors that does not fit into that view. At least you cannot give them a natural explanation. You have to look for the cause of it outside of nature. This critique also applies to Richard Dawkins, who introduces the concept of means as an extra-natural force that can go against the natural selfishness. The means cannot come from our nature because that process that produces only bad things. So where do they come from? Dawkins has no answer to that. As you all know, Kropotkin has a more nuanced view of nature. He shows that ruthless competition is not the only factor in evolution. Nature also contains cooperation and many other things. As Kropotkin pointed out, the appearance of societies on the earth preceded the appearance of man. So social life, society, was not a human invention. Humans came out of social animals. Humans evolved from other animals that had social structures and societies, and these animals must have had social feelings, social instincts, social behaviors. This means that we do not have to look for the origins of pro-social behavior outside of nature. It is in us, just like other instincts are. This is also in line with what Darwin believed. All animals that live in social groups must have developed some kind of social instincts, otherwise they would not have survived as a species. Thus, we don't need to see a radical break between nature and morality or social behavior. We don't have to suppress our instincts in order to be good. Huxley and Dawkins' systems are not naturalist ethical theories. They do not see anything moral in nature, and they believe morality must come from somewhere else. For Kropotkin, this is a major problem. Not just a problem because he's a naturalist and scientist, but also an ethical problem. It's going to be very difficult to do good if the good is not already in us and comes natural to us, which both Dawkins and Huxley are aware of. They both describe the ethical process as a constant battle to suppress our natural instincts. As a consequence, doing the right thing, being ethical and social, is actually something that goes against your own immediate happiness. It is self-sacrifice. This is not an ethical theory that can provide much motivation. Kropotkin insists that we must find moral satisfaction in life, not outside of it. If we cannot do that, Kropotkin says, then Nietzsche has a point, and we must reject all moral value. In the end, here I'll briefly take a look at a few main differences and similarities between Nietzsche and Kropotkin. First, it's interesting to see what Nietzsche might think of Richard Dawkins' version of atheism, because Richard Dawkins is known as the world's most prominent atheist. I'm pretty sure this quote would express his sentiments. All Dawkins has done is to remove God from the Christian worldview, but kept everything the same. This is not atheism to Nietzsche. Atheism means that you have to reconsider everything. For Nietzsche, happiness and human flourishing comes from accepting our instincts, which are our vital force, our life force. This appraisal of instincts leads him to reject traditional morality, such as altruism and solidarity, which he thought was life-denying. Dawkins is a good example of that. For Huxley and Dawkins, our biological instincts must be suppressed and controlled by some external force, the cosmological process or Dawkins's memes, both things that are outside of nature. This life-denying morality is just another form of the ascetic ideal that originates with Christianity. But Kropotkin and Nietzsche agree that we have to look to life and an affirmation of the instincts to be happy. Kropotkin does not see instincts or personal happiness to be in opposition with true morality, as Nietzsche did. Or maybe not, Nietzsche might not consider it in opposition with a different form of morality, but at least he considered it to be in opposition to what we normally consider morality. Kropotkin thought that we did not think that we needed to find morality or social behavior in something outside human nature, and did not believe it was the same as self-denial or suppression of one's own vitality. On the contrary, he believed that it was the social conditions that hold us back from developing our full living potential, and that our instincts are social. To affirm ourselves joyfully, we need and want to share that joy. If you want to be alone, you can do that, of course, as Nietzsche thought his overman would. But Kropotkin did not think that would make you happy. It's a sign of your limitation and your lack of life force. For Nietzsche, the person who is full of vital energy has to abandon society because it's holding him back. But for Kropotkin, the one who's full of overflowing with life seeks society because he wants to share his energy. Nietzsche was, of course, a fierce anti-egalitarian. He critiqued socialists and anarchists and Democrats for being variations of the same Christian ascetic ideal. He believed that people with strong wills, those who did not deny their will to life, would be solitary creatures. His view of human nature is fundamentally asocial. Social behavior is something imposed from the outside. In this sense, Nietzsche actually agrees with Dawkins, except that Nietzsche disliked the social pressures for moral behavior, while Dawkins wanted to promote it. Nietzsche saw equality and democracy as things that would hold the vital individuals back and prevent them from flourishing. In The Gay Science, he says it is absolutely undesirable that a realm of justice and concord should be established on Earth, because it would certainly be the realm of the most profound leveling down to mediocrity. Perhaps a little surprisingly, Kropotkin shares a bit of this critique. Kropotkin is certainly not against equality, but he does agree that equality is not enough. And that the sentiment that comes with seeing equality as an ideal is a petty, amoral sentiment. Equality is the sentiment of counting who gets what and making sure that everyone has had their rightful share. For Kropotkin, this can be a foundation for something better, but it's not morality. Equality would be better than what we have now, but it's not the ideal, because it's a petty mentality which does not amount to true morality. Justice, which is equality, is not the same as morality. But rather than holding people back, as Nietzsche thought, Kropotkin thinks justice can be a stepping stone from where those with more energy, more life force, more creativity can expand their life force and share them with others without counting, without thinking of petty concerns like has everyone had their fair share. For them, the issue of equality would no longer be relevant because they spent their energy and gives it to others without calculations like that. So Nietzsche thinks the unique and creative individuals need to escape society to be allowed to flourish. Kropotkin wants a society where we can all flourish as unique and creative individuals. Kropotkin thinks Nietzsche's solitary individuals must be sad because they have no one to share their overflowing life with. So it seems they simply have different ideas about happiness. For Kropotkin, true morality is about the full development and flourishment of life. It's about growing our potentials, not about suppressing them. It's anything but asceticism. On the contrary, it is life and self-affirming.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ole. My video has frozen on my screen. Has it frozen for everybody else? Is it worth me just turning it off? Okay. Okay, great. Yeah, thanks so much. Another really, really fascinating paper. This has been a really good session. Yeah, really enjoyed it. We have a couple of questions that have come in already from people who are listening in. The first one from Michael. Michael, would you like to ask your question yourself, or would you rather me just read out what you've written in the chat? I guess I'll read that one out. So this is for you, Maria. Your presentation reminded me of a passage in Anarchist Morality that has always struck me. Oh, Michael's here. Okay, I'll let him ask himself.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah,
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I really enjoyed all the talks today at this session. I had a question for Maria, because your presentation and the connection between Kropotkin. Oh, sorry, my camera's over there. Hold on. Yeah, that's better. Your connection to new materialisms struck me because it reminded me of a particular quote, and I was wondering if you have any thoughts on it. There's a quote at the start of Anarchist Morality where Kropotkin says, I've put it in the text or in the chat, but he basically says, if we want to be able to understand morality, we shouldn't go look for laws or for God or whatever, but we should go back to not just humans, but animals and plants. And then he says, and rocks. And I always find this reference to rocks, frankly, hilarious. But yeah, I think it kind of has a new, I think your presentation in a weird way sheds new light on that. I was wondering if you have any ideas, particularly about the connection between mutual aid and ethics, and that related to new materialism.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for your question. I'm sorry if I need some time to remember English words. I'll try to do it quickly. So thank you for your comment. I think it's, as I understand, this question is about how is it possible that the stones and rocks and everything else practices mutual aid, yes? So from my point of view, as I understand this connection. So the stone as such can really hardly practice mutual aid, I think, but the significance of the mineral for the tree, for example, from which the mushroom draw and transport minerals is not in doubt. It's not a question of making stones subjects. I think here is the main mistake in understanding the problem and this revision. The problem is to abandon the subject category inherited from European metaphysics and considering the meaningful agency of all that once seemed to us inert matter in the storehouse of resources. Now that ecosystems are collapsing and, for example, glaciers are melting, this is really important because although glaciers do not practice mutual aid like birds or animals, their agency, active significance for all life today, including animals and birds, is undeniable. And I think in this sense, they are involved in the networks of mutual aid, not as subjects, like, for example, in Cartesian sense of word, like someone who has the soul and the immortal soul, but as agents that are very important for everyone and everything, but that were invisible in through the prism of all European metaphysics, as I understand it. I hope that was the answer. Okay.
Yes, I Thank you for your comments. I was specifically wondering about the connection to morality as we understand it as humans, but in both humans and non-human animals. Is the point that we should take actors into account in our own acts, or is it also that it can teach us something about morality itself?
I see. So I think here is the point about the new ethics, but as it's understood in the new materialism's perspective. So the new materialists say that today the question of morality is about how we not disturb the assemblage, so they call it in postmodernism, how we not disturb the assemblage in which we are the participants. So it's not about the religious or metaphysical morality, but the case of morality, the morality itself, must be also rethought. So the revision of morality is also needed, like the revision of matter. And if we do it, and if we abandon the religious perspective, we can see that it's not about the good in abstract sense, but it's about not disturbing the assemblage inside which we are living and inside which we are making the networks between the creatures, beings, and things. So yes, you're right that in the old paradigm, it's impossible because we don't have any philosophical opportunity to understand the rocks and the sense of old morality. But if we make this revision, it's getting possible. I think so.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent. We've got the next question from Sean. You're already presenting, so you're welcome just to ask it yourself if you'd like.
Yeah, I thought I'd just ask in the chat. There might be some echo though, so don't talk until I finish. Yeah, it's a question for Ben. I loved your paper, Ben. It was very interesting, and I really enjoyed your abstract as well. I was very excited to hear it because we think of this mutual aid concept as something that that could be so universal, but obviously it is so limited. There are loads of people that don't think they should provide mutual aid for certain types of people. That's not probably how any of us feel, but obviously that's a big part of the world. And the real question I have is, do you think that there is a solution to this problem? Is there a sort of rehumanization or just a general philosophy of human and animal inclusivity? Or are we already moving towards this with what I would hope is an increasing belief in racial equality, but also, recently we've had kind of a resurgence of the far right, and the far right is kind of based on the idea of, not including certain people. So, yeah, I guess there's more than one question there, but hope you can comment.
Yeah, thank you. I'll try my best, because I don't honestly. Whenever it gets down to the practical level of like, what does a revolutionary humanism look like today? It's like I don't know, but I have a few different thoughts. Well, the what is to be done question, I always try and keep it very material. It's like there's, as most anarchists are well aware, there's profound wealth inequality, particularly between the global north and the global south. Within the United States, there are parts of the United States, particularly like on Native American reservations, particularly in very segregated communities of color that do not have access to clean water, that do not have access to reliable electricity, right? Do not have access to reliable housing, right? Like these conditions that are prescribed to the third world are very much present within the global north, but notwithstanding, there's a global scheme of power that's really clearly set along colonial lines, to the extent where I don't think it would be accurate to say that colonialism ever really ended, so much as took a different kind of form. So in that regard, I think the what is to be done, and this is maybe the assertion that I was thinking might get some people irritated with me. I think that decolonial activity has to take precedence over to an extent, like anarchist activity. I think that decolonial activity has to be anarchist to an extent, but I do think it might come to a point where anarchists have to bracket some of the anarchist tendencies and support decolonial movements. You know, I'm thinking about like in the 60s, most anarchists didn't support decolonial movements because they aligned themselves with revolutionary nationalism, or because they aligned themselves with a post-colonial state. And so a lot of anarchists were not on board with decolonization. Now, I don't think that that's so much the case these days, but I would say essentially my feeling would be anti-colonialism has to be, you know, of a number one priority. In terms of creating a new humanism, I think that there is a narration of racial equality that I find, I think that there's a difference between a liberal multicultural humanism that is willing to incorporate kind of like diverse perspectives versus a revolutionary humanism that for me is fundamentally oriented around material wealth. Like the difference, I don't know if people were, would have seen it, but in the US, you know, during Trump, there were a lot of these like little posters people would put on Facebook that was like a rainbow stick figure hugging a Trump supporter stick figure, and it was like, love Trump's hate. It's like, that's not that's not anything. But that kind of gesture of like this like very performative, like we support refugees with no material commitment to doing so, I think that's really part and parcel with the kind of narration of racial equity we have today. And so I don't know if it's what we have now is really a product of like performative contradictions, or if it's if it is really truly a move toward inclusivity. But I think that the production of a new humanism will come about through insurgency, both intellectual and material. And that insurgency will be anti-colonial. I don't know if that answers the question at all.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, the things about decolonization, the importance of that, I think, yeah, certainly. And like you say about insurgency rather than liberal reformism and minority inclusion, yeah, you did answer the question, is what I'm saying. I think it's nice as well. It speaks to some of the discussions we had yesterday about Kropotkin and also just like national revolutionary movement. The idea that you're kind of thinking about your own country rather than the world, I think, is something that has kind of come up in some of the discussions about Kropotkin as well. So thank you.
Great. Okay, we have next question from Cord. If you'd like to ask it yourself, Cord.
Oh, hi. Yeah, hello. Welcome. Welcome. Thanks. It's been a long day, everyone, for this wonderful panel, first of all. I have just one comment for Bennett. I mentioned Anderson's Under Three Flags in the chat, and I mean, anarchism has had this anti-colonialist legacy, and it has been adopted, I mean, as you know, by many people from colonized countries, and I think versions of anarchism were practiced there that would be much closer to Winter and to the dismantling of Man 1 and Man 2, also to an extent. And I was just wondering whether you have any comments on that strand of anarchism, which we might have neglected here a little bit because of our focus on Kropotkin to an extent. And I also have a question for Maria. I don't know if you're familiar with this whole Andreas Malm dismantling of new materialism, but I'm somewhat sympathetic to his critique of new materialism, that granting agency to all these many diffuse actors ultimately disallows you from doing anything. You know, that it is because you're incapable of separating intentional actions from the things that a stone does or a ecosystem does and so on, you kind of almost relinquish responsibility for political action, and that you have to make, you know, while you acknowledge all the interconnection between beings, and while you try to get away from Western subjecthood and so on, you still need some kind of account of agency that gives particular responsibility to particular agents and acknowledges that they have a determining role to play over other agents. So I was just wondering whether new materialism also has this apolitical dimension, which ultimately prevents us from doing anything, and tackling the problems that Bennett has outlined so nicely.
Thank you for your comment and for your question. Yes, I understand what you're talking about, but I think we should combine several perspectives simultaneously. So the practical one in our political activism, eco-political activism, and social political activism, and also the intellectual perspective and others, and find a way to reconcile them in a non-contradictory way. So it's the hardest thing. We should understand that, for example, post-anarchism can be useful, but as an academic prism, intellectual prism, which helps us to understand something important that we couldn't see before, and about what we couldn't think before and reflect before. So the new materialisms can be useful also in our epistemological practices, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't do anything else, for example, in our social political activities. So, for example, I'm an activist, but it's for Saturday, and for Sunday, I'll go somewhere else and do something else there with somebody. And so we should combine these dimensions, I think, and it's the task for us, for the inhabitants of the contemporary situation in the world. Yes, that's how I see it. I hope I did answer the question. Okay.
Yes, thanks.
Excellent. I have a question for you, Ole. I was really fascinated, especially by your argument that Dawkins, in sort of locating morality outside of nature, has an almost idealist reading of the origins of, I guess, like thought and essence and those types of things, which obviously, for being a like purported man of science, is ironic, especially. So I was wondering, firstly, if you could. So you talk about how Dawkins kind of relies more on Huxley than he does on Darwin in that sense. Do you think that there's any sort of latent idealism within Huxley's thought that Dawkins has kind of picked up on and reproduced, or is that very much just a misreading on Dawkins' part, or some sort of own intellectual inconsistencies within his own thinking?
It's hard to say, because Dawkins, for being a man of science, he rarely gives his sources. He rarely gives any references. For example, in his works, he repeatedly gives almost at verbatim quotes Thomas Malthus without referencing him. Like it's almost word for word the same as Malthus says, and Dawkins does that many times without ever saying that it comes from Malthus. So Dawkins doesn't reveal his sources. So I don't know how inspired by Huxley he is. but it's clear that it's basically the same philosophy as Thomas Malthus. As Huxley. And my guess is that it's just the Huxleyan version of evolutionary theory became the dominant one. Because it does not have Darwin's theory taken seriously is a pretty radical one, because it places humans in nature. It places humans as an animal among other animals. Even Darwin himself was uncomfortable with that, and he did revisions and went back and forth on it. But taking it seriously is pretty radical and relates to new materialism that Maria was talking about. And I don't think people, even those who accepted his theory and still do, were quite ready to take it that far. As Huxley said, he in private really in private thought that yes, evolutionary theory is right, but man must be special. And it's the same as when the Catholic Church accepted evolutionary theory. The Pope said, with the exception of man must have something different. And it's the same thing Richard Dawkins is doing. He says, yes, evolution is true, but man is something special. Like we have broken out somehow of nature and evolution because we cannot find that thing that we consider special in humans. We don't see that in nature, they claim, which is but Kropotkin says, points to nature and says it's right there. So, but yeah, it's there's an idealist element for sure, which makes it a dualism, because on the one hand they have materialism, and on the other hand they say whatever the morality that they say does not exist in nature must then be idealist, like it comes from somewhere else. And for Dawkins, it's clearly idealism, because for Dawkins, it's memes. Goodness comes from thoughts and words.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Thank you. And I completely agree. I think that's really interesting. And yeah, there is absolutely, at the very least, an inconsistency in that thought. Okay, so we have about 5 minutes after this panel. We'll just go through the chat quickly.
Did you want me to respond to Cord's question?
Oh, yeah, that'd be great, actually. Sorry, I forgot about that.
No, I was just going to say, I think, I think part of the disadvantage of the methodology of looking at the European construction of man is that, you do it at the expense of every other form of being in the world. And I think the at the same time that I say that like this like global anarcho-communism isn't possible alongside the colonial the maintenance of colonial hierarchy, I think it's really evident that communities around the world have been practicing anarcho-communism for like thousands of years. And in addition to that, like you point out, there is an anti-colonial embrace and an anti-colonial reading of anarchism, which I really like a lot. I've been reading a number of Black anarchists in the U.S., like Kawasi Balagoon, Lorenzo Combo Irvin, and Ashanti Alston, and different figures who I think in terms of enacting an anti-colonial anarchism are like it's a really important set of readings to have in mind, just because they do give a very clear perspective of like, okay, this is the material program for how we address racialization, colonization, and anarchism. So yeah, I appreciate the question, and I think that's just kind of, that is the insurgency that acts against, European man.
Great, thank you, Bennett. So a few other things from the chat. We had Tom saying that I think Gaia theory can help us with this question in that it views all living beings and ecosystems as one, so everything is practicing mutual aid together at once. And then says Maria's put it nicely as well. Dimitri has replied saying, how is Gaia theory radically different from Spinoza's pantheism? And then Tom said it's just, I guess, his conception, the Gaia conception is more recent. We have, did you ask that one, Cord, that you posted most recently?
It's fine. I think that would take a little bit too long to discuss.
Okay, maybe we're coming to a bit of a natural endpoint in that case, given that we're 3 minutes from the end of the panel. Again, I would just like to thank so much everyone who presented in this. It's been really fascinating. We've had some excellent questions as well, so thank you for your contributions, everyone, too. Before we close the session down, I'd like to remind you all that we do have a discussion after this one, starting at 3 p.m. That runs until 4, so please do join again for that. We'll then have closing remarks from 4 until 4:30. So yeah, again, thank you so much to everyone for presenting and attending, and we'll see you in half an hour. Oh, and Bennett's left his email in the comments if anyone would like to get in touch and ask anything else. I'm sure the other presenters are also happy to take further questions if anyone has them. Great, thank you.
Bye.
Oliver, while you're still in the sessions chat, can I briefly ask you in person whether anyone's ever written on the Nietzsche-Kropotkin connection, or is that something that you've developed on your own?
I don't know. I mean, there's at least one book on Nietzsche and anarchism. I forgot its name.
Yeah. I know which one you mean.
Yeah. Then there's Kropotkin tends to be mostly criticized by anarchists who are inspired by Nietzsche. Like the post-structuralist anarchists, Saul Newman. But I think that's based on the misconception of Kropotkin as a one-sided essentialist. Kropotkin clearly acknowledges the complexity and chaos in human nature, like that we contain lots of possibilities. Yeah. He's very explicit about that. It's kind of absurd to say that a man who spent his whole life fighting injustice and the bad behaviors of human beings, to say that he believes humans are fundamentally good. Clearly he does not believe that, but that's what often the strawman he's criticized for believing, even in his own time. So I think the post-anarchist critique of him is quite misguided.
Saul Newman is terrible on Kropotkin. The classic anarchist essentialist. It's all bunk as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, but obviously there are interesting similarities and disagreements between them, Nietzsche and Kropotkin, but I don't know if it has been studied. Basically, the reason why I came into it was because I was writing this book chapter, and the reviewers, I mentioned Nietzsche in relation to Dawkins, and then the reviewers were all like, "You need to do more Nietzsche. Like you can't just drop him there." And then, so then I started looking into reading more of Nietzsche, and I think it's very interesting.
Yeah,
but also Kropotkin, because Anarchist Morality, I believe that essay was written in response to an individualist anarchist, a Stirnerian or Nietzschean anarchist so I think Kropotkin sometimes speaks with different voices and does different arguments depending on who he's talking to. And in Anarchist Morality, he's definitely addressing the individualist or nihilists, those who reject all morality.
That's really interesting. I've never thought of that kind of interlocutor.
He intended in his book Ethics, the last chapter was never written, and that was supposed to be about going in deep with Stirner and Nietzsche. So we'll never know exactly what he would have written, but he drops some hints here and there where he mentions them in other works.
Yeah, and maybe he would have discovered, some areas of overlap. Nevertheless, this equality is not enough argument. I thought that was really intriguing. That they would have aligned in one way or another. Yeah. Thanks a lot, Ole.
Can I chime in quickly on that topic as well, very briefly?
Sure.
Well, just because I remember reading an article, I can't find the specific article now, from a while ago. I think it was about Kropotkin planning a book, or maybe it was the Ethics, about having chapters about like important thinkers. And I remember reading that he'd excluded Marx, and that was considered obviously kind of like one of the spicier things in the book, but that he wanted to include Nietzsche. There's also an article by Alvaro Giron called Kropotkin Between Lamarck and Darwin. I'll paste just the reference in the thing. Yeah. I'm not sure where he gets this reference from, Alvaro, but he says on page 198 that he said that Kropotkin, after mutual aid, wants to extend his evolutionary theory to ethics, partly in response to the fact that Nietzsche is becoming very influential within the anarchist movement, and that this would lead him to write his book on ethics. I know from his correspondence he discusses Nietzsche like very rarely, but a little bit as well.
Oh. So felt the need to kind of intervene in that takeover. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
Robert Emma Goldman was hugely inspired by Nietzsche too.
Oh, I didn't know that.
I mean, Nietzsche was politically against everything that anything that progressives and anarchists, socialists, whatever, are for. But anarchists have still managed to find a lot of inspiring ideas in Nietzsche.
I think like a similar thing can be said about Herbert Spencer as well, in that I think that anarchists, and Kropotkin especially, tended to pick the bit they liked from very prominent thinkers, and including these harsh individualists. And obviously he would disagree with his side on like communal society, but and I imagine the same could be said about some like intense communal thinkers who don't care about individual freedom. He might have taken that bit and ignored the rest, but I can't think of any examples.
It would be very funny if in this book he had included Stirner but excluded Marx. I don't know, just as a gesture. that would have amused me.
It is strange that it doesn't seem like Kropotkin was very interested in Marx. I don't know.
Too grandissima, right, Sean?
Yeah, that was the quote from yesterday.
Yeah.
He thought, in fact, I find it very interesting because obviously, rather than like kind of confronting Marx and saying this is why I disagree, which is obviously what Bakunin did a lot, Kropotkin just seems to completely try and ignore him as much as possible. I'm not sure if that's a tactic or if that's how he felt, but he just does not talk about Marx almost ever. And obviously he's an incredibly influential thinker, but not quite in his time period as well, I guess. It's not obvious when Kropotkin is becoming an old man in the 1890s that Marx is going to become this, like, one of the most prominent thinkers in history. He probably felt that Marx was going to be lost by the wayside by the 20th century.
It'll pass. Yeah.
I mean, because the thing is, like, it happens, obviously, Herbert Spencer, who Kropotkin was a big fan of, everyone thought that he was going to live forever as a big thinker. And then by 1910, everyone had forgotten his name. Like, he was just, like, dead to the world. Yeah.
That's what you say, Sean, as well about, I guess, the idea that, well, the potential Kropotkin's idea that maybe Marx would be forgotten by history and others wouldn't. It's interesting in relation to what you were saying, Ole, about about Dawkins kind of reviving Malthus, who's just been completely thoroughly delegitimized by, and has for 150 years, that anyone would try and reappraise or salvage anything serious from Malthus.
I went through. I found digital versions of most of Dawkins's books, and did a electronic search for Malthus, and it's not until I think the 2000s that one of his books contains an actual reference to Malthus. But Malthus is the Selfish Gene is full of quotes and passages that are taken directly from Malthus without ever mentioning him, and in other works of Dawkins too. But yeah, I guess it's the name is taboo, so they just didn't say where he got it from.
And what's interesting on that as well is that Sean and I have spoken about this recently, but Malthus and Darwin were contemporaries, and I think they used to spend time together at family meals. They had a close personal relationship, and I think they were both at Oxford at the same time.
Oh,
yeah,
I actually didn't know that.
All right.
Fabulous. See you all in 20 minutes for the final discussions.
Yeah.
Go dash off, eat some food.
great. See you then.
Thanks, Ollie.